Hi everyone, it's Sarah and welcome to my crochet channel. Today's video I'm going to show you how to crochet our healing wrap shawl. It's a really interesting pattern. It has a beautiful shell repeat and a straight end, and then on the other end we have these beautiful scalloped edge, and it looks complicated, but it's really quite easy just by decreasing the amount of shells that we do on the end of the rows. Don't worry, I'll show you how to do all of this. It's a beautiful shawl, lightweight and lacy, and I think you're really going to love it. Now it measures about 19 inches wide and about 60 inches long. If you want to adjust that, you can find those multiples and stitch counts on the blog where the free pattern is located. And as always, that pattern link will be down in the notes underneath this video. To make the healing wrap shawl, you're going to need 10 ounces of a medium weight number 4 yarn. Now this yarn is the Shawl in a Ball by Lion brand, and the color is called Healing Teal. This one is also Shawl in a Ball. Let's see, the color is, there it is, called Calming Desert. Isn't that beautiful? I'm going to be using some of this for my demonstration today. But to make the shawl, you're going to need about 10 ounces, unless you make it bigger, of course, and then you'll need a little bit more. Each of these skeins has about 5.3 ounces. Now, it used to be called Shawl in a Ball. Now, if you want this yarn, it's called Shawl in a Cake. It's the same yarn, they just changed the way that they package it. We're going to be stitching with a J hook today, which is a 6.0 millimeter crochet hook. And the reason we're using a bigger hook is we want this to be open and lacy. So make sure when you're stitching that you're stitching loose. If you have a tendency to stitch tighter, you might want to go up to the next size as well. But I stitched this one using the J hook, 6.0 millimeter, and it makes a nice open and lacy wrap shawl. You'll also need your needle just for weaving in ends and your scissors. All right, let's get started. We're going to begin with our slip knot, and then we're going to chain 52 chains. We're going to chain this initial 52 chains just a little bit loose. Now, I'm not going to be chaining 52. I'm going to be making a swatch of 20 chains and show you how to do the repeats and the rows. All right, so we're going to chain. You're going to chain 52 chains, and I'm going to chain 20. Now we're going to stitch a double crochet in the 4th chain from the hook. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yarn over, go in, pull up a loop, yarn over, go through the first 2, yarn over, and go through the second 2. Your first 3 chains count as 1 double crochet, and then we stitched another double crochet. And now we're going to stitch 1 double crochet in each of those chains across. Now, this yarn can be a little bit tricky, and so you need to be careful and make sure that you stitch 1 double crochet in each of the chains across. And for a medium number 4 yarn, it is a little thinner, but they're calling it a medium number 4 because of the fuzziness of the yarn. And so we're stitching 1 double crochet in each of those chains, moving all the way across. I have stitched 1 double crochet in each of my chains, starting in the 4th chain from the hook. Now you started with 52, so you're going to have 50 double crochets. I only have 18 because I started with 20. We're going to chain 3 and turn. Now we're going to begin our shell stitches. Our chain 3 counts as our first on this row and on every row. We're going to double crochet in the next double crochet. We're going to skip the next 2 and then we'll stitch our shell stitch in the next. And our shell stitch is 2 double crochets, 1, 2, chain 1, and 2 double crochets, all in that same stitch. And then we'll chain 1. 2 double crochets, chain 1, 2 double crochets, chain 1, all in that same stitch. And now what you'll do is you'll repeat this across. Skip the next 2, shell stitch in the next, which again is 2 double crochets, chain 1 and 2 double crochets in the same stitch. And chain 1. One thing to remember before you begin this shell stitch row is to check that bottom row and make sure it's not curling in or pulling. You want it to lay nice and flat. Alright, so what you'll do is you'll continue to repeat your shell stitches across, skip 2, shell stitch, which again is 2 double crochets, chain 1 and 2 double crochets in that same stitch, chain 1 and repeat, and you'll repeat this all the way across your row. When you get to the end of the row, you should have 4 stitches. You're going to skip the next 2 and then stitch 1 double crochet in those last 2 stitches. And of course that last stitch is that chain 3. And then we'll chain 3 and we'll turn in just a second, but let's take a look at it. And you'll notice it looks a little what I would call poochy, and you want it to be that way. You want it to lay flat down here, but you want your stitches to look a little poochy. It needs to look loose and lacy, and that's the way that the pattern works. All right, let's do row 3. We've stitched our chain 3. We're going to turn. Our chain 3 counts as our first double crochet, so we're going to double crochet in the next double crochet and chain 1. Now we're going to go to the chain 1 space of our first shell stitch. So we'll go in and we'll stitch a shell stitch, which is again 2 double crochets, chain 1 and 2 double crochets, 1 and 2. Chain 1 and repeat. Shell stitch in the chain 1 space of the next shell stitch, which again is 2 double crochets, chain 1 and 2 double crochets, 1 and 2, and chain 1. And we'll repeat this all the way across our row. And of course, you'll have more shell stitches than me because I am just working off a swatch. Here's my last shell stitch for the row on my swatch. 2 double crochets, chain 1, 2 double crochets, chain 1. So we've repeated our shell stitch, working across, stitching our shell stitch in the chain 1 space of the previous row's shell stitches. Here's my last one on my swatch. You should go on all the way across, chain 1, and then we place 1 double crochet in those last 2 double crochets. There we go. And chain 3. And so you can see it really does have a nice lacy appearance to it. And I love the way that the shell stitches lay. And this is the way that row 3 should look. And of course, you'll have a lot more shell stitches in between. Remember, I'm just doing a swatch. All right, let's do row 4. We've chained 3. We're going to turn. Again, our chain 3 counts as our first double crochet, so we'll double crochet in the next one. Chain 1 and go to the first chain 1 space. Two double crochets, chain 1 and 2 double crochets in that chain 1 space. And chain 1 and repeat all the way across our row. Whoops, went in the wrong spot there. There we go. Got to make sure we're working our shell stitches in our chain 1 spaces. There we go. Chain 1. Here's the last one on my swatch. So I'm stitching my shell stitch in the chain 1 space from the previous row's shell stitches. There we go. Chain 1 and 1 double crochet in the last 2. There we go. And again, chain 3. There we go. And so this is how row 4 should look. You've got 2 double crochets, chain 1, and then you have your shell stitch, chain 1 in each of the chain 1 spaces from the previous rows, chain 1, and then 1 double crochet in the last 2. And this is the way that the pattern repeat will work. And again, I know I've said this already, you have a lot more shell stitches. You should have 14 shell stitches with your 2 double crochets on each end for your wrap shawl if you're doing it according to the written pattern. And you're going to repeat row 3, which we did on row 4, for 75 more rows. And that gets you a nice long wrap shawl. Once you've done your repeat for 75 more rows, then we'll begin that tapered shell stitch edge. And so this is how it should look. You're going to have 2 double crochets. You're going to have 14 shell stitches with your chain 1s in between, chain 1, and then 2 double crochets on the end. And then we'll start these shell stitches. And that's really quite simple. What we're going to do is just decrease by 1 shell stitch on each row. And I'll show you how to do that with my swatch, and it makes a beautiful scalloped edge. So once you've stitched across your last row, which you should have stitched that additional 75 rows, now you chain 3 and turn. And on this row, we're going to begin that scalloped edge. And so we have our chain 3. We're going to stitch a double crochet in the next stitch, chain 1, and then we'll work across the row the same way that we have been stitching a shell stitch in the chain 1 spaces of the shell stitch with the chain 1s in between. And we'll work it exactly the same till we get to the end of the row. So I'm going to stitch a shell stitch in each of my shell stitches until I get to that last shell stitch. Chain 1. So now I'm stitching my last shell stitch of this row. And I'm going to chain 3. I'm not going to stitch in those last few stitches, and we're not going to skip here. We're not going to stitch in those last 2. We're going to chain 3 at the end of this shell stitch. So we didn't stitch here. Here's our last shell stitch, and we chained 3 and turned. Now we're going to stitch a double crochet in the next 2 double crochets. 1. We'll skip that chain 1 and stitch a double crochet in the next. All right, now we're going to chain 1, and we're going to go right over to that first chain 1 space of our next shell stitch and stitch a shell stitch. And then we'll stitch our shell stitches all the way across like we have been doing. 1 shell stitch in each of the chain 1 spaces, moving all the way across. There we go. Chain 1, 2 double crochets. Chain 1, and this brings us to our 2 over here, so we're going to go ahead and stitch 1 double crochet in those 2 double crochets and chain 3. All right, now what you're going to begin to see is that your scalloped edge is only going to be on this side. This side is all going to remain straight and the same. All right, so chain 3, turn, 1 double crochet in the next double crochet, chain 1, and we'll stitch our shell stitches across, 2 double crochets, chain 1, and 2 double crochets, 1 and 2, chain 1, and what we're going to do is we're going to repeat what we did on this row. We're going to stitch across, and we're going to leave this last shell stitch unworked. All right, so for my swatch I just need to do 2 more. 1, 2, chain 1, 1 and 2. And again, you'll work this all the way across, working those shell stitches as we already know how to work them. Then we don't work in this. This is our last shell stitch, And so we worked our last shell stitch. We're going to leave this unworked and chain 3. All right, so on this row we had 4. Then on this row we have the 4. We stopped, stitched those stitches, moved back this way, 2 double crochets, then we worked the next 3, leaving this portion unworked. That's where our last shell stitch was, down here, and then we worked here. And now we're chain 3 and we're going to turn again. We've already done our chain 3, so we're going to turn. We're going to stitch a double crochet in the next 2 double crochets. So there's 1 and 2. And we'll skip over that chain 1 space and place our double crochet there. Chain 1, and then we'll go right back to stitching our shell stitches. And see how you can already see how that scalloped edge works? We'll go right back to our last shell stitch of our row. And again, this side does not taper at all. It stays straight, so we chain 1 and add 1 double crochet in each of those 2 double crochets. 1 and 2. Chain 3, and see that tapered edge? Isn't that beautiful? All right, let's continue. Chain 3, double crochet in the double crochet, chain 1, and back to our shell stitches. And you'll continue to do these the way that I've shown you the last 2 rows, and you'll lose or taper down 1 shell stitch every 2 rows. So you'll go from 14 to 13 to 12, 11, 10, 9, all the way down until you only have 1 shell left. All right, so I have 2. I'm going to chain 3. I'm going to turn, stitch 1 double crochet in the next 2 double crochets, chain 1, stitch a shell stitch in this last shell stitch, chain 1, 1 double crochet in those last 2 double crochets, and chain 3 and turn. Double crochet in the next double crochet, chain 1, and this is our last shell stitch. And I want you to see how it's tapered off. Isn't that beautiful? You lose 1 or you taper off 1 of your shell stitches every 2 rows until you reach the last shell stitch. Chain 3, turn, 1 double crochet in the next 2, chain 1 and 1 double crochet in those last 2 double crochets, and then you're finished. Whoops, dropped my scissors. There we go. Tie off and weave in your ends, and you end up with this beautiful shell stitch edge, and you don't have to add anything else to it. It just automatically looks beautiful. And that's really how easy it is to make this wrap shawl. Once you've learned how to do the shell stitches, it whips up quickly, and then to finish off with this lovely scalloped edge is really an easy technique and a fun ending to a project. And remember, you don't have to use the shawl in a ball yarn. You can use any medium weight number 4 yarn that you have on hand.